All right, A pushers. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Let's get going on a topic that you should have already read upon and hopefully also watched another video on from Daniel Jose out there in California, talking about the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams, our first two presidents. A lot going on here, some really fascinating stuff, and some things that are still lasting with us today as a nation. Without further ado, let's roll. So we're going to open up, of course, with my man, George Washington, the nation's first president, and in my opinion, arguably the greatest president in U.S. history. One of the reasons for that is that Washington came about this job with a certain sense of humility. Um, Washington largely left his ego absent. Um, he was absolutely qualified for the job, but understood the weight of the position. And it actually took Alexander Hamilton's convincing Washington to take the job. He kind of reluctantly accepted the job, which may not sound great, but I think it shows the respect that Washington has for the office. And that's something that will become clearly evident throughout his tenure and perhaps even more in his retirement. Washington is elected unanimously through the Electoral College provided for in our Constitution. And the runner up used to become the vice president. I get a kick out of thinking about that. We could have been coming off of a Donald Trump Hillary Clinton term over the past 4 years, and that would have just been amazing. But here we are during Washington's presidency. You'll see it was unanimous, but not all of the territories or states, for that matter, voted. New York was late. Uh, North Carolina and Rhode Island each had not yet ratified the Constitution. Nevertheless, here we are with George Washington as our president. Um, as I said, his reluctance was in part because he knew the weight of the position. He sees the country kind of already in its infancy, being somewhat divided along partisan lines, and we're going to get to understand what those partisan lines are here a little bit further. Um, and he knows he's going to be at the center of these controversies. That, of course, is going to be a pattern that's going to hold true for all presidents from here on after. It's notable that in his journals, in his memoirs, he says upon the eve of his inauguration that he feels like he's going to his execution rather than becoming a national hero. Thankfully, history books will largely remember him as a national hero. And again, it's in large part for his demeanor, some actions that he establishes with very little guidance from the Constitution, by the way. We're going to see a video that talks a little bit about that. And again, in large part for how he leaves the office, certainly better than he found it, and establishing really as the first president, establishing a very high bar in terms of precedent for what we expect out of our United States executive leaders, out of our presidents. Um, he is very careful in terms of the title that he takes. You're going to see a scene in the John Adams film where John Adams wants to propose, these certain titles for what are we going to call our president, His Highness, His Royal, and so on and so forth. And Washington absolutely refutes any title that would implicate this idea of royalty. That's going to be a big marking of Washington as president, that he wants the American people, and for that matter, the American political system, to understand that the executive, the president, as it were, is just a cog in the wheels of our government, just a piece, right? And we talked about that with the checks and balances and so on. Um, Washington opts instead for the title of Mr. President, a title we still use, of course, today. I'd like you to pause in just a minute um, to check out this video on Washington because I've confessed before that Washington's kind of my historical man crush, right? I think he's this legendary badass. Um, I think some of that could, of course, be open for interpretation. This video goes through the efforts to point out that Washington is just a man. Washington is a flawed man. We have spoken at length, I think, about the great American contradiction. Not only was Washington a slaveholder, Washington, as I think I've mentioned in class before, relentlessly pursued his runaway slaves. And so he is not a perfect man. I do think he was the perfect man for this job at this time. And I think in many respects, um, he represents the best of what we want American presidents to represent. And so when we learn more about George Washington, you can decide for yourself, is he a legendary badass or is he a legendary badass? Take a couple moments, please. This video is about 5 minutes long and it's well worth your time. There's some really interesting stuff in here with particular regard to, again, as I said earlier, how little guidance is given through Article 2 of our Constitution. Remember, the Constitution goes Article 1, legislative branch, Article 2, executive branch, Article 3, judicial branch. And there's actually very little guidance for what is the role of the president. And Washington is left to sort that out and set the table for future presidents. Take a couple minutes and watch this, please. All right. So now we've got Washington as president. Let's talk a little bit more. I know the video got into some. Of course, your reading got into some. Perhaps the other video the other day got into some. But I want to talk a little bit more about the actions that Washington takes while he's president. This lines up, of course, with AMSCO chapter number 6, American Pageant chapter number 10, the Joe's Productions video I gave you the other day, a little bit the video you just saw right now about the American government taking shape and what direction we're going to move through and towards during this first tenure of George Washington. So, Washington is instrumental in strengthening the federal government. Again, you will recall that in the wake of Shays' rebellion during the critical period we referred to, under the Articles of Confederation, Washington said, "I do not conceive we can exist long as a nation without having lodged somewhere a central power which will pervade the entire Union." Um, and so Washington is making an argument, right, for a strong central government, which is what the Federalists, right, are all about at the Constitutional Convention and Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, making this argument that we need this central power. But again, there's very little guidance, and so Washington, one of the first things he does is establish the Judiciary Act of 1789, which gives more shape to Article 3 of our Constitution, um, defines really what the judiciary branch will look like. And so it's notable that one of the first things Washington seeks to do is protect the integrity of the Constitution. Um, it gives structure to these courts whose job is to interpret constitutionality. Next, Washington builds up the executive branch. So, again, Article 2 initially really kind of talks just about the president and the vice president. And we know now that Article 2 includes essentially the entire federal bureaucracy. I think there are 26 cabinet heads. We talk about the presidential cabinet. And so we're talking about all the department of this, department of that. The most recent department added to the presidential cabinet, of course, in the wake of 9/11 is the Department of Homeland Security, but would join such departments as the Department of State, right? The Secretary of State's always an important appointment. Secretary of Education, Secretary of Labor, the Department of the Interior, the Treasury Department is always a key one. And Washington gives shape to this federal bureaucracy, um, where the cabinet essentially makes up his closest advisors on those matters that fall under the jurisdiction of their cabinet position, of their department, if you will. So, right off the bat, Washington names Thomas Jefferson as his Secretary of State. Secretary Knox becomes the head of the Department of War, which no longer goes by that name, and arguably, still one of the most important appointments for a president is who will become that president's Department of Treasury head or the Secretary of Treasury. For that position, very notably here in 1790, Washington appoints Alexander Hamilton to be the Secretary of Treasury. And these three men make up, at this point, the crux of his presidential advisory board, if you will, mind you, and we'll see this spelled out a little bit in the John Adams film that the vice presidency is arguably much less important than these other cabinet positions. Um, it's also notable that Washington, who I'm going to talk about later as a vehement uh, anti-political party guy, which is another reason, quite frankly, if I'm being honest, and I can wear my my politics on my sleeve here, is another reason why I love him because I think there's a lot of weaknesses to be had in a strict two-party system. Um, but Washington, while recognizing that these political parties are forming, we talked about how he sees this kind of division happening and he's going to put himself at the center of it. It's very notable that what does he do? He draws in from both parties. When I mentioned the appointment of Thomas Jefferson as his Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of Treasury. So, two of his most trusted advisors are from the opposing political parties. The political parties that are in existence here during Washington's tenure are the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Later on, we'll come to just call them the Republicans, not yet to be confused, okay, with the Republican Party of today. In fact, a couple times throughout American history, we're going to witness what we would call a critical realignment of the political parties. That's a lecture for another day and something, quite frankly, you're going to get into a lot heavier next year in AP Gov. Regardless, here Washington has Hamilton, Secretary of Treasury, is a Federalist. Jefferson, the Secretary of State, is a Democratic Republican. Generally speaking, right, we know that the Federalists are looking to increase the strength and the stability, the very nature of the federal government, the central government. And the Democratic Republicans may have fallen into that camp prior to the Constitutional Convention of being anti federalists, or at least those who would have feared the central government from growing too strong or too rapidly or out of control. So the Democratic Republicans are really going to make a stronger argument in favor of states' rights. It just doesn't make sense anymore that they would call themselves anti-federalists because that would suggest, right, that they're against the government, and that, of course, is not the case. Here we have these two political parties forming, and the divisions are about to get significantly greater when Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, introduces his bill to manage the nation's finances and the banking system, which, if you are a Democratic Republican, you would argue is an overreach of your constitutional power. But we want to dig into exactly what that means and why that is and what this debate is all about a little bit further right now. We're going to talk about Hamilton's financial plan as Secretary of Treasury, right? 1790. His plan for strengthening that department, the Department of Treasury, in managing our nation's finances, which he says is critical. That here we are, we're going to be this new nation, we're going to be a powerful nation. Unlike, of course, in the Articles of Confederation, we got to flip that script, right? We've got to have some centrality and some strength in how we manage the finances of an entire nation. So, what he wants to do, first of all, it's a three-pronged plan. One, that the national government is going to assume all state debts. Um, and so the states, remember, let's go back to Shays' Rebellion, are, many of them at least, are sitting in an incredible amount of debt, in large part due towards the wake of the Revolutionary War, right? Wars cost money. Um, and Hamilton wants to unify the states. He doesn't want to have those divisions evident in the states where there's going to be kind of real wildly disparate tax plans and finance plans state by state. The federal government is going to take over all of this state debt. Now, that's going to anger, of course, a lot of the states that have very little debt, the states that kind of managed their finances appropriately. But part of that plan then is to say that with the federal government assuming that debt, that the states and the people are going to be invested in the success of the federal government. Now, to pay those debts off, Hamilton wants to institute some national taxes. In particular, he wants to tax alcohol. Whiskey, in particular, is the alcohol of choice during the day. And he wants to place a tariff on all foreign imports. When we use that word tariff, it's going to come up time and time again. All it means is a tax on imports. That's a tariff. Okay. Um, the Southerners, the backcountry farmers are going to be opposed to this. So here we are, 0 for 2 so far, and Hamilton pleasing everyone with his financial plan of 1790. He's going to go over 3 when he argues for the creation of a national bank to help regulate the banking system nationwide and help the government finance these debts and provide financial security throughout the land. Um, and so this is Hamilton's plan, which, again, if you're a Democratic Republican, you would argue is a tremendous overreach of power. Very controversial. We want to get in here a little bit to what I would call constitutional interpretation. Okay. There are 2 kind of schools of thought here that I will teach you as a strict constructionist or a loose constructionist. A strict constructionist, in this case, like the Democratic Republicans, like a James Madison, right? Like a Thomas Jefferson, would argue that since the Constitution makes no mention whatsoever of a national bank, that there therefore is no right for the federal government to establish a national bank. It's an overreach of power. Hamilton here would probably be more what we call a loose constructionist. Okay. And so what we mean by that is that whereas a strict constructionist would say, what you're going to do, what you have the right to do, has to be specifically mentioned in the Constitution. A loose constructionist would argue, well, hold on. The Constitution allows for the creation of an executive branch. It allows for the president to make sure that we have this cabinet, that the cabinets have certain positions that are reasonable to have, and The whole point behind federalism is to make sure we have a strong national government. So just because the Constitution doesn't allow for it specifically called out by name doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Uh, there is loosely room for these types of developments, right? That the Constitution, they would argue, a loose constructionist would argue, is a little bit more of a living, breathing, evolving document. Um, Now, George Washington himself has some reservations about this kind of reach of power. But Hamilton is able to convince Washington to come along, is able to convince Washington that it makes sense. And so we do have the establishment of the first Bank of the United States. This is, by the way, where Hamilton convinces Washington in an effort to bring along the Southerners, mind you, who are going to be and will remain more about states' rights, in order to bring them along with the plan that we're going to move the national capital further south to Washington, D.C. Remember, at this point, Virginia is very much a southern state. D.C. is within, for all intents and purposes, the boundaries of Virginia. So this is just a little kind of concession towards the South, and this is where Washington, D.C. becomes established, and the White House will be constructed here. And you'll see actually what a hot mess that looks like in the John Adams film, but that's neither here nor there. We do want to understand a little bit more, right, about Hamilton's financial plan. And I want you to understand what we mean when we talk about strict or loose constructionist constitutional interpretation. That component of Hamilton's financial plan that called for taxes on alcohol and whiskey in particular, we mentioned was very controversial, especially to Southerners and backcountry farmers. And that is going to lead to the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Now, this is really notable. It's very similar, if you will, to Shays' Rebellion. Remember, Shays' Rebellion is Daniel Shays and right a couple thousand of his closest friends rising up against the state government of Massachusetts for their overreach and overtaxation, and they're threatening to take land for those farmers who can't pay their taxes. The Whiskey Rebellion has a very similar look in that it's again, primarily Southerners and backcountry farmers that see this national taxation as an overreach, and they actually call a militia to rise up and create their own rebellion against the federal government for the very same reasons that Shays rebelled against the state government. Again, for the second time today, I'm going to make reference to when Washington says, in the wake of Shays' rebellion, listen, this government is unsustainable if we don't have a strong central government, right? And so here we're faced with a very similar rebellion to Shays' Rebellion with the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Only now Washington has his strong central government, and he's able to quickly put down the rebellion. And it's an early success in a what could have been a major test for this new government. Could we, in fact, put down kind of revolt from the people? And certainly we, as it were, did. Um, you can make some, more controversial arguments about what was really behind the reach of governmental power and so on and so forth. But the long and the short of it is that the strong central government that Washington called for is effective here, as evidenced by their successful response to the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. With respect to some foreign affairs, we're going to talk more about this when we get to Washington's farewell address as well. Um, Washington is very careful to make sure that the nation remains neutral as it relates to foreign affairs. He warns the nation, as we'll see later with respect to his famous farewell address, about permanent foreign entanglements. Um, And with the French Revolution taking place in Europe, and again, as we see time and again, conflict between Great Britain and France, Washington chooses to remain neutral. He declares, in fact, 1793, a proclamation of neutrality. Now, again, the American president is never going to please everyone, right? The Federalists, okay, are actually going to be in favor of aligning with the British. Why? Well, oddly enough, right, at this point, post Articles of Confederation, the idea is that there are more governmental similarities between a federalist government and the government from which they rebelled in Great Britain, where there is a strong central power. The Democratic Republicans, who are more about states' rights and, for that matter, power staying closer to the local people want to be aligned with France, where the French Revolution is all about enhanced democratic principles. Um, that proclamation comes to a test by France when they send a diplomat, if you will, by the name of Edmund Genet to Charleston, South Carolina. And Genet's mission in the United States is to engender support among political leaders in favor of France and coming to the aid of the French in the French Revolution. By the way, right? Just like the French did, you'll recall, for the Americans during the American Revolution. But Washington, again, demands neutrality and actually throws Genet out of the country. This becomes known as the Citizen Genet controversy. And again, you'll see a depiction of this in the next couple episodes of John Adams that we're going to watch. So, the impact of the French Revolution is that it creates some political divides in the United States between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Um, Washington's proclamation of neutrality will become tested. Uh, and in wake of that relationship between the French and the colonies back then during the American Revolution, there had been a principle and agreement known as the Franco American Alliance of 1778 that says the United States is going to always help the French islands in the Caribbean against attack. Well, that attack comes to be, of course, it's coming from who? The greatest navy in the world. Who's that? Great Britain. America finds itself in a very difficult position as just a little baby country at this point to stand up to the world's greatest navy. And Great Britain essentially just ignores and runs roughshod over American rights as a neutral nation. They seize over 300 American ships off the coast of the Atlantic into the Caribbean Sea and impress hundreds of American soldiers. That is, again, to essentially kind of kidnap and draft American soldiers. So, right off the bat, this nation is tested with respect to not only foreign entanglements, but will there be kind of an early war, right? The French are upset with Americans' neutrality in the wake of their assistance for us. And the British are really just going to go ahead and test the strength of this new nation from a military perspective. So Washington leads a series of foreign treaties. Most notably, perhaps among them, is Jay's Treaty, which the opponents of Jay's Treaty would argue America gets very little out of. Hamilton convinces Washington to send John Jay. You'll recognize John Jay as one of the authors of Publius in the Federalist Papers. over to Great Britain to negotiate a treaty in the wake of these ship seizures and impressment and so on and so forth. Um, and Jay's treaty prevents a war with Great Britain. So we're going to escape that, which is a huge success. I don't think at this point America is ready yet for another war with Great Britain. Probably feeling like we were pretty lucky in the first one. Um, we get sovereignty over those Northwest territories. You saw those on the map earlier. That's going to essentially be the modern day states of like um, portions of Ohio, of course, Michigan, Wisconsin, uh, portions of Illinois, Indiana. Um, but it doesn't do much else for the United States. So again, if you're an opponent, you think that this is a weak treaty, but it does keep us out of war. Um, where that Northwest Territory is located, of course, is up there towards kind of where Spain was still occupying a lot of land as well. Remember that like Spain had been involved right from kind of the south, and the Northwest Territories were kind of from the north, where Great Britain still had for many years retained control over what amounts to Canada. And Jay's treaty puts some pressure on Spain to negotiate with the United States in what becomes known as Pinckney's Treaty, named after Thomas Pinckney, which gives America the right to navigate the Mississippi River and then establishes a border between the United States and Florida, which remains Spanish territory. You'll notice, right, that what we're really seeing in our ability to navigate the Mississippi is the increasing territorial claims and western boundary of the United States, right? Proclamation line of 1763, it was the Appalachians, and then it pushes towards the Mississippi River. And now we've actually got control, or at least navigational control, of the Mississippi River. So whether they were necessarily hugely popular, uh, they were significant achievements from a foreign policy perspective for George Washington. With the approval of Jay's Treaty and then Pinckney's Treaty, the tensions begin to ease between Great Britain and the United States. Um, but France, again, is infuriated by Jay's treaty. They see it as a slap in the face. They see it as an abandonment of not just the Franco American alliance of 1778 in principle, but the general relationship that had been created between the two nations, these nations that each held their own revolution in the name of democracy. So now it's actually France that comes in and starts seizing American ships because they're perhaps rightfully angry. And so America has to avoid war once again. And Washington this time sends his vice president, John Adams, to uh, negotiate with the French and avoid war. But what you're going to see as a result, a lasting result, is more of a long term shift in allegiances, even though Washington warns against permanent foreign entanglements, from this Franco American allegiance to more of this Anglo American allegiance. Um, and despite a few other dust ups to come in time period four, you're going to see this great relationship begin for the most part here, or seeds are being planted between Great Britain and the United States. Washington retires as president after two terms. Um, and he accomplished a lot, right? He kept the United States out of war. He strengthened uh, some foreign relationships or salvaged some foreign relationships, strengthened them in the case of Britain, salvaged them in the case of the French, um, establishes this strong central government that we clearly needed, runs for reelection, um, wins, and then after two terms, he retires as president. Washington, despite the fact that you're never going to be able to please everyone, uh, Washington was incredibly popular, and it's really notable that Washington could have easily been reelected to a third term. Mind you, at this point, there are no term limits. We do have now a two-term presidential limit, but that doesn't come around until the 22nd Amendment, giving us this two-term limit. Here, Washington could have gone on, but it's incredibly notable that he does not seek a third term. Um, he wants to set this precedent that there should be no confusion of an American executive leader as like a king, right? Um, Washington, in his farewell address, makes a point of that claim. He makes a point about warning against foreign entanglements. And very notably, he makes a warning against political parties. Uh, Political parties are likely to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government. I think Washington's warning here is very prescient in that the division between two political parties uh, causes allegiances and alliances um, that are sometimes to be seen as more important than faith and service to country. And Washington greatly recognizes that threat. So when Washington retires as president, the first president, right, it's really notable that hey, he's a great success. He gets out of there scandal free. He was a man of honor and integrity. He established a strong central government with legitimacy, authority, strength. He walks away after two terms, establishing that as kind of an unofficial precedent for future presidents. And again, he warns the country of uh, two major principles to keep in mind moving forward, right? About the danger of foreign entanglements and about the danger of political parties. Unfortunately, I think it's become very clear over the years that America promptly ignores both of those warnings. Um, but this man is incredibly um, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? He's incredibly strong in making these warnings and in establishing, I think, as the video said earlier, kind of what the presidency is to be all about. What I would like you to do, and I'll remind you of this at the end of this recording, is to go through the accomplishments of Washington during both terms of his as president. And can you list, in your mind's eye, the three most important actions or policies taken by the federal government during the Washington administration that helps to solidify or strengthen the United States as a nation? Um, Briefly describe at least one of those as why and why you think that is so important and so significant. We can talk about this in small groups in our next class. You can label this actions that strengthen the federal government under George Washington. But I want you to identify what you think perhaps are the three most important actions under GW that strengthened the federal government. And take one and kind of describe it in some detail. Put this in your notes. We're going to talk about it in our next class. The possible answers, of course, are beyond what you see here, perhaps. Um, but you could certainly feel free to choose three among these. And again, they're not necessarily something that Washington did himself, right? Like Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. But they take place during his administration. And presidents, like quarterbacks, get perhaps too much credit or perhaps too much blame for what happens during their administration. But I think the biggest, or at least one of the biggest takeaways during Washington's administration, again, is the strengthening of the central government. All of these things happen under his watch. What are the three most important, and which one would you like to write about in detail? I would also like to point out that we need to understand the formation of the first two political parties. The Federalists primarily led, their kind of de facto party head is Alexander Hamilton. Remember, Hamilton is a loose constructionist, right? And the Democratic Republicans, their de facto party head is Thomas Jefferson. They would be seen more as strict constructionists in terms of their efforts towards constitutional interpretation. What do each of these parties believe about centralized versus localized power? Who might they align with among the European governments, and why? Um, what did these men in particular think about the other? Um, what do they think about the people? I want you to consider what that question means. What do they think about Republican values? And again, don't get that twisted with the political party. We talked about that in our last class, I believe. And what is their overall stance on government? How do they view kind of the role and the nature of government? Okay, so these are some things, again, we can talk about in our next class. At this time, please clean and sanitize the spaces you've been using. You can hear I'm recording on Friday while you guys are out. All right, so let's continue with our notes right now, getting into John Adams as president and all of the important takeaways from his single term in president. I would confess right now I have a much lower opinion of John Adams than I do of George Washington. So Adams takes over in the election of 1796. He was, of course, George Washington's vice president. Um, he is going to run against Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican. Um, and Alexander Hamilton might have actually been, he was the same party as John Adams, a Federalist, might have actually been their. At this time, Group A should go to the next class. Hamilton might have been kind of the de facto leader of the Federalist Party, but Hamilton, not only just for his policies, right, um, but for his personality, made a number of enemies along the way, and he was just too unpopular as a character to carry the mantle for the Federalist Party. So Adams, Vice President Adams, earns the nomination. He gets elected, and as the system used to be, the second place candidate in the Electoral College becomes his vice president. That, of course, is Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson. A quick film here, linked on the presentation, of course, on John Adams. And I'd like you to pause and watch this for a couple seconds. Well, a couple minutes. Here you go. Okay. So, as discussed in there, and again, as was in your reading, one of the notable instances that we need to get into, and is depicted in the John Adams film as well under the Adams presidency, is the XYZ affair. When Adams takes office, the that Franco-American allegiance had been continuing to deteriorate, and the relationship between America and Britain and Spain improves, but Adams has a goal of uh, improving that relationship. He sends a delegation to France to negotiate with the French over certain border disputes and what had taken place in the Caribbean and so on and so forth. Um, but before they begin negotiations, the French demand a loan and a bribe, which, as the video you just watched says, wasn't all that uncommon. Adams, however, is incredibly offended and infuriated by it. And so he sends messages to the Congress saying, prepare for war with the French. Um, it's called the XYZ affair. Group B, get to your next class. The messengers who demanded the bribe were simply known as messengers X, Y, and Z, and so it becomes known as the XYZ affair. But it's notable that, like, right off the bat, Adams is thinking we're going to go to war with France. Of course, it doesn't happen. Napoleon's going to come to power 4 years later, or 2 years later, actually, after this. 1796 is when he's put in office. XYZ is 1798. And the relationship between the French and the Americans is going to improve once again. But it's a little bit touch and go here, where, like, for the third time, America is on the brink of war. And in my opinion, they're on the brink of war because Adams is acting a little pig-headed, a little hot-headed over the situation. I don't think it was quite worth telling Congress to prepare for war over this. But nevertheless, in my opinion, that's kind of who Adams is as a person. Um, I think evidence of who Adams is as a person is also evident in the Alien and Sedition Acts. And if I'm being honest, it's because of the Alien and Sedition Acts that I think Adams is probably in my, like, bottom five or bottom three worst presidents. Zinn writes about this as well in the chapter "A Kind of Tyranny" that we got through. Um, it just is mind blowing that here we have a nation established in large part on freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of protest. Uh, Adams was all about that during the American Revolution. And here he sits in office, and he's got a lot of critics. The presidents always will. And so Adams spearheads this effort of the Federalists to silence his opposition with what becomes known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts place roadblocks uh, for foreigners to. At this time, would Group C please go to your next period class? The Alien Acts make roadblocks for people who want to become American citizens, foreigners who want to become American citizens. But even more importantly, the Sedition Act allows the government to prosecute anyone who is engaged in sedition against the government. That, again, this is going back to, like, what the how the British viewed freedom of speech and press in the 16 and 1700s. We go back to the epical Zanger trial. That anything said against the government, Adams calls sedition. Um, and he has newspaper editors who criticize his political party arrested and thrown in jail. And absolutely notably, um, the Democratic Republicans, as well they should be, in my opinion, are enraged at such a blatant trampling of the First Amendment as soon as the Constitution was essentially passed, and the Bill of Rights with its First Amendment saying that we have a free press, and Adams' little ego can't take it. And so it's for that, I believe, probably more than anything, that we're going to see Adams become a single-term president, and he's incredibly. It certainly doesn't do anything to improve his reputation. The Democrats can't do much about it, though, right? Because at this point, even though Madison and Jefferson had said that this wouldn't be the case, they just finished promising the American people that the central government would not become tyrannical. Right? We spent all kinds of time on this on the Federalist Papers, but at this point, it is the Federalist Party that controls the executive branch, John Adams, the presidency, both houses of the Congress. They have had the opportunity, because the Judiciary Act of 1789, Washington's essentially a Federalist, They appointed all the justices, so they control outright all three branches of government. And so the Democratic Republicans, they're left, their hands are tied. There's nothing they can do about the Alien and Sedition Acts. So, what would a Democratic Republican do? Well, they turn to the states because they believe in states' rights. And Jefferson and Madison, the two strongest Democratic Republicans, actually secretly write resolutions that they get others to submit into the Virginia and Kentucky state legislatures that assert that the states have the right to nullify or to cancel federal actions that they don't agree with. So this is like the birth of the states' rights movement. We're going to be talking later more about kind of other nullification crises. But it's notable that they actually, because here they are with important federal government positions, and they're secret for decades about having written the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Um, the resolutions fail. In a system of federalism, states cannot, despite what Southerners will continue to argue, states cannot nullify federal actions. Another bell over here. It's a good time. Um, but the philosophy that they put forth.
At this time, all students should be in their next period class.
The philosophy that they put forth, this nullification present in the Virginia Kentucky resolutions, becomes sets up the table for a really fierce election in 1800. So, what is John Adams known for as a president? Well, especially in wake of these Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, he's known for creating divide. And that divide is going to set the table for essentially an eternity of conflict. This is still the political debate that's evident in America today, right? It's about the overreach. This we talked about the principles of American government, including a limited government. Um, and and Adams greatly overreaches, whereas Washington kind of had balanced that line. Adams overreaches and sets in motion this debate over the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. But remember, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, and so Adams is known for creating divide and for overreach of his presidential power. It is why he becomes a single term president. He is incredibly unpopular, obviously, with the Democratic Republicans for his overreach, but even within his own political party for his stubbornness, his pigheadedness, um, his personality, if you will. Um, so, closing thoughts here. I think it's really important to understand the impact on American politics of the major actions and policies that America witnesses during the first two presidents. From a foreign affairs perspective, we've got the French Revolution, Jay's Treaty. You can throw in Pinckney's treaty there as well, both under Washington. Adams with the XYZ affair. From a domestic affairs perspective, I think probably even more importantly, right? We have Hamilton's financial plan under George Washington is going to have a serious lasting impact on American politics and what exactly is the role of not just the executive branch, but the federal government itself. And then, of course, under the Adams administration, both the Alien and Sedition Acts and what that says about American politics and political divide, as well as in response, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions and how that sets up further debate in American politics for eternity, essentially. Uh, and so it's important that we understand all of these major actions and what the reactions are to both foreign and domestic policies and actions during our first two presidential administrations. That's, of course, going to set up the election of 1800, which will bring us to the end of time period four. The election of 1800, as I think I'm going to try to make the case, is arguably the most important election in American history. That's right, an election from 1800, from 220 years ago, is arguably the most important election in American history. Why? Because it is the first peaceful transition of partisan power at the highest levels of government, right? From Washington to Adams, we don't have a partisan change. Both Washington and Adams are Federalists. But here we have a single term loss, and we have a transition from a Federalist to a Democratic Republic, or Democratic Republican, excuse me. And the nation is still watching this little baby nation, this great American experiment in democracy. And the question is, can it survive? Um, it's a legit question at this point for such a young nation, with such stark divide already created in its political scene. Um, but thanks be to Thomas Jefferson, in fact, that as we talk about it, we're going to get into it next. Um, the election of 1800, many Democratic Republicans see as the revolution. They call it the revolution of 1800. And Thomas Jefferson famously says upon his inauguration, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. We are Americans." And so he implements some policies that would favor his political party, but he doesn't just undo everything that had been done over the previous 12 years, and he puts country ahead of party. And for all his flaws, Thomas Jefferson is an incredible domestic diplomat for having the foresight to treat this transition this way. And we should be so lucky should we see such a peaceful, graceful transition take place here uh, 220 years later. Um, we'll see what shakes out in our own election of 2020 and how this comes to an end. But I think all presidents, again, for all his flaws, should take some cues from how Thomas Jefferson is about to handle this. The election of 1800 is the turning point that's going to bring us into time period four, which we will preview as we're heading into our midterm exam. Um, but that's essentially the end of our new content for time period three. Guys, essentially the end of our new content for the first semester. Um, we are going to get into in our next class, and then on a homework assignment, we're going to get into the John Adams film. So enjoy it. I do ask again that you pay attention to kind of the homework I asked you to produce for discussion in our next class. And that is, again, what do you think the three most important actions taken under the Washington administration are in terms of strengthening the federal government in the United States? And which policy would you like to expand on in some specifics further? That's all I got for you today. Thanks, guys. Take care.